Well, welcome to this week's episode of Tree Lady Talks. Now, I've often wondered, where did it all begin? Where did the first trees grow? What did they look like? And how on earth did it start? So I was delighted when I was watching Earth on the BBC in the UK with Chris Packham, and I was enthralled by today's guest who really showed me how it all started. And I thought, I've just got to know more. And I know that you listeners will be interested because you love a bit of nerdy science. So I'm delighted today to be with Dr. Sandy Hetherington, who is a plant evolutionary biologist from, amongst many other things, the Hetherington Institute. Sandy, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me on the podcast. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So, Sandy, tell us a little bit about your academic work, please.
Yeah, so really the real goal of our research is to try and understand the early steps in plant evolution. So I think the big questions that get me really excited are, when did plants evolve and how did they transform the earth from a kind of barren, rocky, a wilderness like that to the kind of lush forested ecosystems that we know today? And so to try and investigate those questions, we combine looking at evidence from the fossil record with the diversity of living plants alive today to begin to try and piece together some of those big questions early in plant evolution.
So it's a great detective and deduction process based on science. So let's go back literally in the mists of time to hundreds of millions of years ago in the Earth's history. How did the first plants arrive on Earth?
Yeah, so we know that the first land plants, so the ones that would then give rise to all the flowering plants, the trees today, we know that they started life in the water. So their ancestors were aquatic. And the first thing to note is they were aquatic but living in fresh water. So often we think of things coming out of the sea, but actually there was a transition first to life in fresh water. So similar to some of the kind of algae you might see growing in a pond today. And it's from an ancestor like that at some point roughly around 475 million years ago, an ancestor which lived in the water made this really important transition onto land. And that's really the starting place for land plant evolution, this initial transition to land. And that was the start of what was then going to be this amazing diversity of plants alive today.
So a sort of soup of plant cells lapped up against a rocky shore and sort of clung on. I'm just going to turn the heater, sorry. A soup of plant cells lapped up against a rocky shore and sort of took hold on basically rock. Rock, I guess, which is weathered by rain and ice. So it must have been a sort of gradual weathering down by sort of lichens and mosses and things. What do we know about what those very early plant-like structures look like?
So that's a really good question, and one that scientists like myself and other what we call paleobotanists, so people studying fossil plants, are really interested to try and find out. Now, in many cases, the fossil record only gives us some really kind of small fragmentary clues. And during the very early time during plant evolution, we don't have that much information. So just to give a little bit of background for this, the very first kind of signs of life that we have on land of plants are evidence from fossilized spores, so the reproductive parts of plants, similar to pollen today. These things blow everywhere, and therefore they're more likely to get into the fossil record. So we know that they were there at this period of time I mentioned earlier, roughly 475 million years ago. But we really have to wait for about another 40 million years until we actually see the types of plants that were making those spores. So when asked, what did those first plants look like, I think the first thing to say is we don't really know, and we had to wait quite a long time. But when we first find them, we find that many of these plants are tiny. They are absolutely minuscule in size, and I think would look very, very unfamiliar to what kind of plants we're familiar with today. So one of these types of plants is known as Cooksonia, and these things are the size of a kind of pinhead, so they're absolutely tiny. To investigate them, we often have to look at them under a high-powered microscope, and we can just see these tiny little branching stems, and it's hard to picture a world that was covered in these little tiny branching stems, as you said, that were most likely quite reliant on water, so um, growing in these ecosystems surrounding by ponds and kind of boggy areas, and they were just beginning to take hold, really.
How exciting. And so I'm going to ask a series of really daft questions, okay? I might be a bit Cunk on Britain here, which is a well-known comedy show in the UK, but so when you find these tiny little spores in the fossils, I'm guessing that you know how long ago that was by the age of the rock?
Yep, precisely. So it's the age of the rock, and we can use um, isotope dating to actually get an idea exactly how old those rocks are. So we kind of use a combination of these things to really begin to pinpoint in time how old the things were. So we get a feeling from the rock in terms of what other organisms were present in the rock as well. But yeah, it's fortunately some of these isotopic dates allow us to go back millions of years, and therefore to have this confidence that these things really were incredibly ancient.
Wow, how exciting. And when you found these first plants that were washing up against the shore, in my simple mind, did you find any evidence of fungi? But are the
Yeah, so
two
this
things coexisting straight away?
And yeah, I think this is one of the most exciting findings from these early fossils. So there's a variety of these early fossils I mentioned that are really tiny, and we just have fragmentary remains. But there's one very, very special site which is based not too far from where I am up in Edinburgh. So it's actually a bit closer towards Aberdeen, and the site is called the Rhynie Chert, and it's named
Oh,
after this
yeah.
small village of Rhynie. And what's so special about that site is it has this exceptional level of preservation. And that means that not only do we get the plants, we get the entire ecosystem. And just like you say, one of the key things from the ecosystem is the presence of fungi. They are there, they're ubiquitous, and they are forming these symbiotic relationships with the plants at this incredibly early time. And what's quite nice as well is it's not just the direct evidence from the fossils that reveals that this is a really ancient symbiosis. Actually, the genes in living species today and the interactions we find in living species today also hint that it must have been an incredibly ancient symbiosis with fungi going back all the way to the beginning. So, plants have been on land, but they've been doing it with fungi for the whole time, really.
How fantastic. I absolutely love that. And listeners, don't just be listeners, be viewers too, because we're on YouTube, Tree Lady Talks, and this conversation is going to be peppered with images to take you back literally in the midst of time. And what I really love about these sort of conversations and exploration about the early world is that you sort of leap forward casually 40 million years.
Yep.
I mean, hang on a minute. Let's think back to next Thursday. What did you have for dinner? I mean, these sort of time scales are just extraordinary. Now, on the screen, we're going to show an infographic now, which shows how this first period, which I can't pronounce, Sandy, something like Silurian. Go
The
on, you say it.
The Silurian period.
Silurian.
Yeah.
Okay. Gently merges into the Devonian period. Let's talk timescales for listeners now. When did the first period end and when did the Devonian period start and how long did it last?
Yeah, so really what we're looking at is a period of time roughly around 430 million years is a really important switch between the two. And off the top of my head, I would need to triple check about exactly the dates of the Silurian, but once we get into the Devonian around that point in time, that then goes on to 360 million years ago. So the Devonian it's a reasonable block of time, and a huge amount of things are happening in this chunk of time too.
Fantastic. And on the infographic, there's a really neat line which shows ground level and it shows the increasing soil depth. So tell me how the first soils developed from the first period going into the early Devonian and how different was it by the end of the Devonian period?
Yeah, so I think one of the most fascinating things about this period of time is not just that plants are getting complex, but just like you say, soil is getting complex, and therefore it's producing this whole extra ecosystem for life below ground. And so what we picture is that during the Silurian period and earlier in Earth history, there must have been some life on land, but it really was something which we'd call, a microbial mat or a kind of crust, a kind of lichen crust that you see on rocks today, really clinging onto the hard bits of bare rock, or kind of gradually covering up, sandy layers of sediment. But this is all about the change as we move into the early Devonian period. So what we're seeing is that plants are expanding. They're expanding around river systems, and where they're growing, they're actually able to stabilize the soil and actually able to produce and maintain larger levels of sediment.
Fantastic. So when we're seeing lichens on a gravestone, on a granite boulders in Devon, for example, in Dartmoor, they are some of our oldest living plant forms in the world, or relative
So
so.
yeah, so lichens are quite a fascinating symbiosis between a fungi and a type of cyanobacteria. So in some ways they're very, very, very anciently related to plants, but also have this extra addition of a fungal symbiosis as well. So they're a very, very unusual organism in that sense. It's two things working together, and they're very unusual, but forming these kind of crust-like surfaces of things, which look really definitely very different to many of the types of things we see around us. But you're completely right. Often surrounding them, you'll often find these small moss-like, mosses just hanging onto the edge of those bare rocks as well. Whereas the mosses are definitely land plants, and they're much more closely related than lichens are.
Fantastic. So in this time where plants are beginning to evolve, we know as tree people and as nature lovers, they need roots. And I understand a great deal of your work has been about early root development. So let's go back to the very first roots that you found in fossils. What were they like?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the earliest roots we find, in many ways, don't think we'd even recognize them as a root. So what we find is that the earliest plants don't have a really good distinction between the above ground and below ground parts. The above ground parts, for example, they don't have leaves. They were just little twigs, really. And the part of the plant that was carrying out the rooting function, so the root, as we call them, were just made up of this massive little hair-like cells that helped them cling to the surface environment. And I think, as an analogy, the closest thing we could see to that today are in plants like moss. So
Mhm.
although moss will often look like a little green fuzzy ball, if you look at it under the microscope, the reason why it's able to grow on a gravestone, grow on the kind of tors on Dartmoor, is because they've got a mass of these little cells that are actually really sticking it and anchoring it to the rock. So the earliest rooting systems we find are masses of those little hairs connected to these twig-like stems, and that was what was enabling them to begin to survive.
Before we move on to how they evolve further, I mean, those very first plants, those twig-like plants, when you've looked at them under a really powerful microscope on a fossil, can you find things like chloroplasts? I mean, were they photosynthesizing?
Yeah, so sadly, the actual intercellular structures like chloroplasts sadly don't survive that far back, which is a bit of a shame. However, we can make the prediction that they were photosynthesizing, and the way we can do that is by making a comparison between all the living plants alive today, and we know that the
Mhm.
vast majority of them developed chloroplasts that look broadly similar and were photosynthesizing. And if they all do it today, the most likely explanation is that that common ancestor that lived all the way back then, 400 million years ago, was likely doing something similar. So although we don't have the direct evidence for that, we know that that's really suggestive based on living species. And then the other line of evidence that makes us think that they are photosynthesizing is that plants need structures called stomata, which
Yeah.
are the small little pores on the leaves that enable them to exchange gas with the environment. Now, stomata are wonderful at taking gas, but they also cause this problem, which is they enable plants to dry out. And so in many ways, there'd be no reason for them for early plants to have these stomata if they weren't using them as a way to exchange gas for photosynthesis. So this is a quite nice structural characteristic that can be
Oh,
fossilized, which again gives us some indirect evidence that they must have been photosynthesizing.
how brilliant, because we know that plants don't grow things they don't need. There's always a
That's true.
reason. There's a
Yeah.
reason for everything. So through that deduction, you can say it's almost certain that they were photosynthesizing. And so that is the first evidence of organisms on the earth using the sun as power and capturing carbon. That's pretty awesome, isn't it? So as we move on to plant development, there's obviously a relationship between what's going on underground and what's growing up above ground. Let's talk about, first of all, as we're in the very early Devonian period, what did the first slightly larger plants look like? How would you describe them comparable to something today?
Yes, I think during the early Devonian, for me, is the first time I think we'd all stand there and say, that looks like a plant.
Yeah.
We're seeing the first things that had leaves, we're seeing complex rooting systems, and they look broadly quite similar to the living group of plants today known as club mosses. So club mosses are a group of plants that you might have easily never noticed before, or have spotted once or twice on a walk and wondered what they are. They sometimes look quite similar to other types of mosses. However, they have this really long evolutionary history. And so some of the earliest club mosses that we can find in the early Devonian are the first plants that we can find that they've got a really characteristic leaves. They have these underground rooting systems. They have a sprawling habit. You can picture them kind of spreading over the surface, some bits growing up towards the light, other bits going down into the soil. And so I think they would be some of the first that we'd definitely say, yes, that looks like a plant, and it looks like a plant I could identify to a modern group.
Fantastic. And then as they got larger, I mean, I want to kind of use the word fern, would that be
Yep. Yep.
fair? So how
Absolutely.
do we
Yeah.
go on from there?
Yeah, absolutely. So what we're getting first, and we call this, when we're thinking about the kind of the family tree of plants that we can see and we can identify these in the modern plants today. We have a group at the base, which is the things like the mosses, and then we have a branch called the club mosses. Next to
Hmm.
them is the ferns. And
Yeah.
so at this point in the fossil record, we begin to see these in an iterative way. So we find the club mosses first, and then we find these early fern-like plants. And they are popping up at just the same time that the ancestors of the seed plants are appearing. And the seed plants are interesting because they today are the vast, vast, vast majority of trees. And so this group of plants is the first group of plants that I think would have been these big woody trees that would be, again, look so familiar. They'd have so many of those same forms and growth and patterns that we're familiar with seeing today. They would have been there from the period of time known as the mid-Devonian, roughly 380 million years ago.
Wow. And I heard and read in your work that some plants that we find today that are just a meter or so tall got up to like 50 meters.
Yep.
So what was better then for the plants that isn't so good now?
That's a really good question. It's really hard sometimes to say, and you'll hear lots of evolutionary biologists and things will often shy away from ever saying exactly what it was, because we don't know what the triggers were for why certain things got bigger or went extinct at certain times. But what's definitely true is, like you said, there's a number of species that became trees that are no longer trees today. So we're familiar with tree ferns, but
Yeah.
actually in the past there was many different lineages of ferns that were tree size. Today that they're quite a small number. So there was groups like the horsetails. You might be used to
Yeah.
seeing these in these wet, boggy environments. They could reach about 20 meters tall or so. You had these giant, thick, woody trunks.
Wow.
And another one called the club moss, as I mentioned to you earlier. One of the groups known as the Isoetales. This is a group of plants that, again, I find absolutely fascinating, but most people will have
Yeah.
never heard of. But again, in the past, they reached these colossal sizes of about 50 meters, and they were nicknamed the scale trees because their bark looks scaly, which is where all the
Yeah.
leaves on the outside of the bark used to be. And so we don't know exactly why they became so huge. We know they were well adapted to wet environments, that the kind of iconic coal swamp forests, these
Yeah.
very swampy settings, and these plants just thrived in that environment. But yeah, how and why they got so big is a bit of a mystery. But what's interesting is they are still alive today, just as these tiny the relatives of them are still alive today, but just as species that are really tiny in size.
How fantastic. I wonder, I mean, obviously there weren't the predators, the animal predators at that time, and also they were just hugely successful in that ecological niche, in that particular climate, in that particular period of time. When I say period of time, I'm talking millions of years, aren't I?
Yes, yeah, that's the other thing
Just
to imagine.
awesome.
It
It's
is,
just
yeah.
awesome. I mean, what do we know from fossil records about the structure of the trunk in terms from a cellular level? I appreciate you can't look at chloroplasts, etc., but do we know about, were they very lignin heavy? Were they very cellulose heavy? Was it similar to, say, a deciduous tree currently growing? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, we do. So we know quite a bit about the anatomy, and that's because occasionally we get these fossils preserved with exceptional preservation. And so most fossils you'll see, lots of them are in museums, there'll be that black coaly colour. And that's really the only remains of the organic material that was there. So they give us a great understanding of what size and shape these things got to, but not necessarily what the internal structure was. But there's other fossils, and we're very lucky to work on a few of these in the lab, site through exceptional preservation that give us an insight into the internal tissues, the structures. And what I find fascinating is, especially amongst these different groups of trees, there's been many different types of habits and anatomies that have actually supported those trees. So if you think, let's take the giant horsetails. They're one of my
Yeah.
favourites. That you grew to these giant
I think
sizes.
we can all see those, can't we, listeners? In your head? Yeah. So that was a giant, millions and millions and millions of years ago. Wow.
Exactly, a giant. And what's interesting about it is similar to their anatomy today. At the centre was just largely a very large airspace. So I think
Hmm.
for comparison, it's like thinking about a giant bamboo as
Yeah.
today, but on an even bigger scale. So it's interesting to think that was one approach that was used. For those giant scale trees, the ones that have the little tiny relatives today, they were
Yeah.
fascinating as well because they actually only made a tiny amount of wood. So a 50-meter tree, but the amount of wood they made in their stems was about this size, despite the fact the whole trunk could be a couple of meters across. And
Wow. What was it?
it's amazing to think.
Fibrous?
Yeah,
Was it?
so the main thing was, just like you say, it had these incredibly fibrous the leaf bases on the outside. So the trunk itself was composed of a very, very thin core of wood. But then on the outside, these really tough leaf bases, that's how they gave the majority of their structural support. So I think again, the best comparison would be maybe things like palm trees,
Yeah.
some of the monocots which get big, but it's hard to imagine a truly giant like this without having lots of wood in the center of it.
So going back to the ones that are hollow,
Yeah.
that's a fantastic evolutionary successful technique because it's going to flex in the wind.
Yeah.
It's going to be strong. It's not going to be too heavy. And we see that with our ancient and veteran trees as trees age and get shorter and fatter and squatter and hollower. And part of that is evolution adapting to the longevity of those species, thinking of oaks, for example.
Yeah.
But this is about, I'm getting the impression of a load of really fast growing, optimum environment species. Do we have any sense of how long they may have lived, an individual? I mean, were they tree rings and how long was their life?
That's a really good question, and one which can be actually quite difficult to get a handle on. It's actually one
Yeah,
of these ones which is quite a fun one because it's quite a lively debate in the scientific field.
yeah.
So there's nothing quite like questions like this to really wind up scientists and get
Uh,
them get a bit hot under the collar in terms of discussing them. So there's been two main hypotheses for these giant scale trees. One is that these things shot up. They shot up at a speed which we can almost, it's hard to imagine. You'd have to be comparable with some of the fastest things growing today. But then there's another counter argument, which is no, these were slow growing, and maybe it took them, 100 or 200 years to reach these colossal sizes. Now, the difficulty is, just like you said, there's wood and tree rings would give us an answer, but because they only have this tiny, tiny wooden cylinder at the center, it's actually very difficult to identify tree rings in the same way we would do in, and we've got lovely examples of fossil conifers and fossil lineages that are around to today, where we can do that. But in these really old ones, we don't have as much evidence for that. And so then it comes down to trying to think about hypotheses
Yeah.
for how do you estimate how fast a tree's growing, where you say, okay, let's think how many leaves it had, how much could it photosynthesize? And that's a kind of really nice thing that we can try and do. But again, gets scientists really hotly debating as to whether these things flew up or grew a bit slower. My feeling, if I was pushed, would have to be to
Yeah.
say that they were probably growing a bit slower. Slower in the sense that they were not, growing over the course of 100 or 200
Yeah.
years rather than going up in 30 years. And I think the reason for that is we know that they were growing in these swampy environments where there's not a huge amount of nutrients. And so if you're in an environment where there's not a huge amount of nutrients, even if you've got lots of light, it would be hard to put on a growth spurt of a couple of meters a year, for example. Whereas it seems like they might have just been a bit slower and taken the time. But again, that is just a guess, so something to investigate more.
I think that's a really strong hypothesis because if they were growing in a swampy environment, it will be quite anaerobic.
Yep.
In terms, and we know that tree roots need an aerobic environment in which to foster. Sorry, I've got a cold. In which to prosper. And but I wonder where you're finding pneumatophores, these sort of wonderful elbows that we have, like the swamp cypress, Taxodium distichum growing. Were they doing the same sort of thing to kind of like get these elbows up there, get a bit of aerobic stuff going?
That's a really good question, and one we have been hunting for in the fossil
Yeah.
record. So, so what we know is we know that especially these scale trees, these scale trees, they had a very unusual rooting system. They had a rooting system which, like the main big trunk of the tree, they had these big woody roots, but they were also quite largely hollow through quite a lot of their rooting system as well. And so one hypothesis is that actually they were able to transport air and gas through that hollow system. And that could be one way they might have been able to get air to some of these more anoxic parts. The other hypothesis is that they have these little smaller rootlet-like structures which stick off the side of those big woody bits.
Yeah.
And perhaps some of them also were involved in either growing into areas with more oxygen, or they were able to take up oxygen from bits of the water. So that's an example where we're still unsure about exactly how they did it, but that's one. And then there's a few other species growing in those swamps as well, and we know that some of them, although we don't have evidence of the kind of pneumatophores in that sense, what we do find is evidence of root adaptations to these swampy environments. So kind of prop roots, cluster roots. So basically all of these roots that we find today in trees, which really help them stand up in boggy environments. So producing large numbers of roots further up your trunk to really stabilize, or to have these quite extensive bases on the trunk to again give them more rigidity. We definitely find there in the fossil record. So just like today, these trees were really well adapted to these quite unusual and boggy environments. And I'm sure that would have kept them up in the strong wind in that sense.
Fantastic. And there's a fantastic image that we'll be showing now of a slice through a fossil showing these central cores of roots being hollow with some little white arrows there. So watchers enjoy those. So I think that I also learnt from your studies is this idea about the root cap. So we know that root caps are really useful. They're sort of at the end of a growing root, and they help they sort of sometimes slough away as they grow through the soil. Am I right in thinking that some early roots did not have that root cap, and that you proved that?
Yeah, this was a really, really fun bit of work that we took a dive into. So the big question for us was to understand when did roots first evolve, and how can we be confident about finding them in the fossil record? Now, part of this sounds a bit like semantics in that, well, obviously you'll find it depending on how you define a root. And so to go about this, we set off with looking at the roots of living species we can see alive today. And as you said, basically every example we have of living species today with their roots, they all develop from a root tip covered by this protective structure known as the root cap. And so really, to pinpoint the origin of roots, what we really wanted to do was to try and find the earliest evidence for those in the fossil record. So again, we jumped on these sites of exceptional levels of preservation, and we knew that from the Carboniferous period, so roughly 350 million years ago, that sort of time, when much of the world was covered by these scale trees, by these coal swamp forests, we could find evidence in cases there of roots covered with these root caps. So we knew that roots were present and looking incredibly similar to what they do today at that point in time. But what we wanted to do was to take that further back in time. And this is again with this site I mentioned earlier, the Rhynie Chert, the site with exceptional preservation came into play. And the reason for that is because the plants in the Rhynie Chert had the potential to be preserved with exceptional preservation. And we had some of these early plants that had the first kind of more complex rooting systems. And so in our work, what we did is took a really deep dive. We went hunting through fossils to try and find evidence of these rooting tips. And after a lot of looking in museums, there's some wonderful collections in the UK that I went around. I also visited collections in Germany, which have vast numbers of these fossils. Examining them under a microscope, I came across the first evidence of what we thought were the root tips. So the very, very tips of the roots, just where we'd expect to find evidence of a root cap. But what was fascinating was despite that exceptional levels of preservation, there was no cap covering these roots. So it seemed to be these things look very, very similar to the roots we know today, but not quite there.
So they've evolved to have root caps, do you think?
Yeah, exactly.
Because
Precisely,
it makes the plants more successful. It's like a protective mechanism, isn't it, to take it through what would have been very early soils. I'm just going back a
Precisely.
few 100 million years. But it would have been craggy and rocky, I guess.
Yep.
And so not to have those would be, ouch, constantly, wouldn't it?
It would have been, exactly.
Yeah, very unscientific language there. Sorry to any deep
No.
scientists listening to Tree Lady Talks. But that's great. So while we're on roots, we are so interested in the fact that there is this teeming ecosystem underground of microfauna and mycorrhizae. I read that in the very earliest plants, there is mycorrhizae fungi on the plant leaf axis, not leaf, branch axis.
Yep.
Am I right in thinking there's a bit of gap in science at the moment, which no doubt you will feel in the early Devonian period with mycorrhizae? What do you know about the evolution of mycorrhizae fungi in the soil and tree roots as you go through time?
That's a really good question. And again, that wonderful site, the Rhynie Chert, gives us a really nice insight. At that point in the early Devonian, it gives us the first direct evidence of mycorrhizal fungus and forming that symbiotic relationship with plants. They're there and they look remarkably similar. Anatomically, they look identical to what we find in these in living species that form a similar symbiosis today. So they were present, but just like you say, what's kind of unusual is they're formed not just in the rooting system, but they're actually formed in quite a lot of areas across the plant itself. So this is unusual in the sense that today, those symbiotic relationships are really focused just on the root. And so the big question is, at what point and how do we get the specialization of that fungal symbiosis to only occur in the root? And that, just like you say, is a question which is really ripe for investigating further. We know if we jump forward a few million years, when we start seeing trees and tree roots, and when we find them well preserved, we find clear evidence of the arbuscular mycorrhizal, the AM symbiosis, and we find those in those tree roots. And we know that in some of those earliest plants, but don't have roots, that they're present everywhere. So fingers crossed we can find a few more fossils that might help fill in that gap and to begin to understand about what enabled and what kind of facilitated the localization of those relationships into one place. And we know there might be a few things contributing to this. We know that the plant might be able to actually interact directly with the fungus and maybe give reason to promote it being in one place or another. And also the plant can also have barriers to stop it moving around. But it's a really fascinating question, and I think it's one that we certainly need some more work on to try and find out.
So going back to relationship with trees and fungi generally, then moving away from just mycorrhizae, is there evidence in the Devonian period or the Carboniferous period? Have I said that right?
Yep, that's
Yep.
exactly right. Yep.
Okay. Is there evidence of fungi in the trunks? You say there is evidence of fungi being all over the tree, of these wall barriers, the pseudosclerotal plates. Can you find those of where the tree is? Maybe within the tree there's a fungi war, as Professor Limbody,
Hmm.
friend of the show, says. You must know Professor Limbody. You know, where one fungi is going, oh, I'm going to get you, and the other one's going, no, I'm going to get you. And then they do like this robot wars in the middle. Can you find that in these records?
That's really interesting. So I think I haven't looked into those specifically, but absolutely, there's definite evidence of clear evidence of fungi in larger parts of the roots, in smaller rootlets. And there's also definite evidence where you can see that the plants themselves are having a response to some, whether it's a pathogenic fungi, and they are throwing up these lignified walls to protect themselves from areas.
Oh.
Kind of wound responses, damage responses. There's clear evidence on that, and I'm also sure that there must be clear evidence of interaction between fungi and fungi.
Oh,
That'd be
fabulous.
a really interesting. I have a colleague at the London Natural History Museum called Christine Struderian, who's an expert on fossil fungi, and she'd be the person to ask. I think she'd be able to give us a quiz
Oh,
there. So
if you
maybe she would be a good
do
person to
let
talk
her
to.
know about this podcast because I
Yeah,
would
definitely.
love to talk to her. No, I
Mhm.
really, really would. That's amazing. Gosh. So these early roots, similar then in their adaptation process to roots today. I mean, once you get towards the end of the Devonian period, are they broadly similar to what we see today?
Yeah, I think that's correct. And there's been some really wonderful work carried out by Bill Stein and colleagues. So this includes Chris Berry at the University of Cardiff, who's done some really amazing work mapping the extent of the rooting systems we find in fossil forests. And there's one very
Mm.
famous fossil forest in New York, in New York State, not right in the middle of
Yeah,
New York,
yeah.
but this is a really lovely example where we've got lots and lots of large trees in one single place, and that gives people a chance to actually map out and see their distribution. And what they found, especially in this setting, is that amongst the woody trees, which look most similar, I'd say, to kind of conifers today, is that they already had incredibly extensive rooting systems, um, tr- going out quite a few meters, 5, 6, 7 meters outwards on either side of these large trunks. And I think in many ways, if I showed you a picture of those, you might just think it looked just like a modern conifer root today.
Yeah,
So I think in that sense, many of those adaptations we think of were already present, and it's quite remarkable, isn't it, to think just how long ago these things that
yeah.
we're familiar with today would have also been there. Going all the way back to 380 million years ago to be able to have a similar structure that we kind of be used to seeing today.
Just want to say that again. That's 380 million years ago. Wow, we really are a speck. And I read somewhere in your work that the soils we have today are only in the last 10% of the Earth's history. So just to put that, it sounds almost modern,
Yeah.
what we're talking about today.
Yeah.
Incredible. The other area of your work that really fascinated me was Fibonacci spirals. What are they? And when did they start? And why are they great?
So Fibonacci spirals are a spiral pattern that we find in nature. So then called Fibonacci after the famous mathematical series, the Fibonacci series. So that's a famous mathematical series. So the first question is, what is it? What's it doing occurring in nature? What's it doing occurring in plants? But it just so happens that this sequence, the numbers in the sequence keep cropping up from a variety of different forms that we find around us, and they are particularly common in plants. And I think the one thing that I would recommend to people next time you find a pine cone, if you
Yeah,
pick up a pine cone and look at the base of it, your eyes will definitely be drawn to these spiral patterns. And you can do this. You can even mark it on with a pen. You can see spirals going either clockwise or anti-clockwise spirals. And if you mark on, if you count up the number of clockwise and anti-clockwise spirals, I can almost guarantee you, because people have done scientific studies on these, and the number goes up to something like 95 or more percent, that when you count the number of clockwise and anti-clockwise spirals, these will be numbers in the Fibonacci series. And so it's quite remarkable to think that this pattern, this famous mathematical pattern, is occurring in a way which is so common that we'd all be familiar with seeing today.
And I think because we've evolved and it's a really ancient plant evolution, which I think 90% of plants follow, something like that, one way and another in their structure, that we find it really pleasing. We find it beautiful. And I think that in many ways, like we've evolved to seek solace and beauty in the colour green and
Yeah.
also in blue, these very natural colours. And there are all these patterns in nature which are shown to have a physiologically pleasing effect on the brain, lowering our blood pressure and making us feel better and releasing beneficial hormones in flooding our system. That these patterns in nature, these colours in nature, are inherent to our well-being. And I think it's fascinating that you've studied it, but I think there's a bigger thing here about our need to be in nature and
Yeah.
why these things are intrinsically wonderful. So these have been around for a really long time. And tell us about how you looked at the early plants, another plant I can't pronounce. And then you made this model. Tell us about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were particularly interested in both the origin of leaves and the origin of these famous Fibonacci patterns. So when was the first time we could turn to the fossil record, identify leaves, and attempt to go hunting for these Fibonacci type patterns? And this brings us back to, again, the Rhynie Chert, my favourite fossil site, and to this time a particular plant called Asteroxylon macchiae. This is
That's the
an
one.
early...
It was on the tip of my tongue.
This is an early club moss, and this was the one that, for me, I think is one of the first in the group of plants that you'd first recognise as being a kind of plant, and it would look familiar today. So this type of plant, we find it present in the Rhynie Chert. It's been described as having these leaf-like structures. So for us, we thought this could be the one to investigate further, to understand a bit about the origin of leaves, and to look for evidence for these famous mathematical spirals. Now, what's special about the Rhynie Chert, as I mentioned earlier, is its exceptional preservation. But with exceptional preservation comes three-dimensional preservation as well. So although when you're holding this, you're actually typically holding just a solid block of rock, all the plant stems within there are preserved in 3D. And so what's amazing, if you make lots of serial preparations of them, like lots of kind of glass flies through them, or a technique called peels, which is almost like putting a little bit of sellotape on and ripping it off and doing that lots of times.
Wow.
It's quite an amazing sort of process. But if you do that to the rock, what this gives us is a record that we can then digitally stick back together and actually picture exactly what the plant looked like in 3D. And so this was a project carried out by started off as a master's student in the lab called Holly Ann Turner, and she did a wonderful job. She just had a real eye for aligning these images up on the computer, and gradually really took a long time to gradually align them all together, to draw around and to trace around the outlines of the leaves. And eventually this gives a 3D model of this shoot system. So she did this, and this was the first time we could really look at the arrangement of leaves in a plant from this period of time. And the first thing that jumped out to us was there seemed to be some evidence of spirals. So we thought, well, this is going to be very exciting. This is likely to be one of the first times we're going to find these Fibonacci-type spirals. And so it came as a bit of a surprise to us that after a long time of looking and a long time of us really having to convince ourselves and finding a few more replicates and having to double-check again, we realized that what was unusual about these is they were spirals, but these were non-Fibonacci spirals. So what that means is when you count the number of clockwise and anti-clockwise spirals, they're not numbers in the Fibonacci series. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not, that they still look like a regular pattern. They still are a spiral form. But this is what it poses as a really interesting question for them being so similar to many living species today, and yet so different because these numbers were different. So it was our first real insight that these non-Fibonacci patterns are in fact incredibly ancient, and therefore these early plants were quite different in some ways to many of the living species we know today.
And you made a 3D model of that, didn't you?
Yeah,
It looks a bit like, you're going to be appalled by this, it looks a bit like a cucumber
it
with a
does.
load of gherkins sort of sticking around the outside, sort of imagine cocktail sticks, and sort of going round in a sort of vague spiral. So isn't it wonderful how all this new technology enables a greater visualization of what things used to be like and what we can learn from that. Wow,
It's
that's
really
amazing.
it's really quite special. I think the 3D print was gave us for the first time just a completely unique view on this. Just like you say, the first thing that stuck out is just how quite large in diameter the stems were. Like you said, it looks quite odd. It looks a bit like a
Yeah,
cucumber with these small little leaves on the side. So that in
yeah,
itself was very interesting. And then what was wonderful was to work with a digital artist who helped us actually 3D print it in its actual size. So we printed a kind of larger version so we could
yeah.
visualize it more, but printed to actual size, we're talking only about a couple of centimeters inside this tiny little cell. And you could almost hold that next to their living relatives today, and they just look so similar, despite there's,
Wow.
it's a 400 million years of evolution between that and the living club mosses. So
A
yeah, that
six.
was really good fun.
So you've been learning about what success looks like in plant evolution. That's absolutely fascinating. I'd like to talk about the future in a moment.
Yeah.
But before I do, we have a wonderful community with Tree Lady Talks, and I've got some listeners' questions here. So I wonder, what prehistoric trees would you like to have seen survive to the present? Clearly, some sort of have.
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. I think it'd have to be those scale trees. They for me are just. I would love to see one in person and to actually, yeah, to be able to really test how quickly they grew and what they look like. What's so special for me about those trees is we find them fossilized and they have a very extensive fossil record. So we actually have good evidence of like fossilized tree stumps. So you can almost you can stand next to a fossilized tree trunk and picture what it must have been like just to look up in the air and see this great expanse of a tree growing up.
Mm.
So I think that would be one I would really love to love to see just how unusual they look like when they were growing and just how different they were to most modern trees today.
I wonder if it were not far off with virtual reality and the modeling that we can do now and AI, actually putting on a headset and actually just being in a Devonian period
Yep.
and walking through the forest. Oh my God, I so want to do that. How close are we to doing that?
I think we're actually relatively good. I think you're right. I think it
Yeah,
would be a wonderful project to do. Um, I know people are kind of exploring those sorts of options. So as you said, we've been making these little 3D models of these tiny little fragments, but
yeah,
there's no reason you can't make a full ecosystem. We have enough evidence. And so I think it'd be a wonderful thing to actually be able to walk through. And then it would be interesting just to think about other, the other ways you can build on those experiences. So to think about what temperature it would have been like,
yeah,
even trying to imagine what kind of things you'd be able to smell. What was some of these,
yes.
it wouldn't be like a pine forest, it'd be something different, and how you go about simulating or kind of predicting what those. I think that'd be a wonderful, wonderful
Oh
project.
my God, I so want to go to a Devonian Forest Experience
Yeah.
Centre, put on a VR headset, walk through and feel the temperature, maybe the humidity, hear something. What would it be? I
Maybe
wonder what
some
it would sound
yeah,
like.
rustling
Yeah.
arthropods in the in the
Yeah.
soil of things. That would be amazing. A big
Wow.
millipede or something.
Oh God, that would be incredible. And actually, and sort of scuffing through. I mean, what the other thing to say is, if I was in that experience centre, surely I'd be up to my knees or beyond in sort of decaying matter. I know we had fungi and we would have had lots of insects and things. But I mean, do we have a sense of like how much leaf litter and stuff
Mm.
was around?
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think one example where we can speak to that is typically those coal swamp forests. We know that it would have been really swampy, and we know they were forming
Hmm.
vast amounts of peat, which then eventually, through geological heat and pressure, became coal. And so we know at that point in time, I think it would have been a very boggy, very peaty, very hard to traverse sort of terrain to go in between. And that would have been one example. It would have been at that. Whereas in some of the other ecosystems, we just don't know. I mean, it's a really nice question to think just about. For example, when did So we'll begin to think about, when trees evolved, but when was there a distinct understory and a tree?
Yeah.
Did in some of these forests we think that there might have just been, large numbers of these trees close together, just growing up in a waterlogged environment. But yeah, to have a bit of a think about when you got the distinction between what we class as an understory growing on those fallen logs, I think is a really, really fascinating question. We hope, again, you occasionally get a fossil which will then, reveal what this would have looked like. But in most cases, we just don't have the evidence.
Wow. If you're listening to this and you know somebody who works for one of the huge film studios, okay, and is great at visualizing this, but needs to do it properly because we will be offended as scientists if it's not done properly. Could we have like a really fabulous visualization of this? And I'm sorry to be crass, but there's probably money to be made, which is all good for research, just to experience this. My God, I fancy that. Well, going back to listener questions, this is Matthew Norman and his daughter. And he asks, what were the early pollination strategies that we're aware of?
Very interesting question. So pollination strategies, as we're kind of mainly familiar with them today, most of these ones are from the flowering plants. But in actual fact, the flowering plants are not particularly ancient from a geological point of view. So although they make up the vast majority of species alive today, they've only been around they only really saw the very end of the dinosaurs, and then they've lasted through when the dinosaurs went out. However, we know that plants have been on land for 300 million years before that. And so when we're thinking about pollination in most of these plants before then, the vast majority of these are wind pollinated. So it'd be like many sort of conifers today, in the case of the ferns, where plants are producing vast numbers of spores, they're getting blown by the wind, and so there isn't as much direct evidence of many of these kind of pollination strategies we're familiar with in flowering plants. There's a couple of early examples where the evolution of beetles was playing a key role in some groups, but in actual fact, we predict that in most cases it was just the wind.
Fabulous. So all this fantastic science about the evolution of plants through the history of time, how can we use this science, in your opinion, and it's just hypothesizing, to deal with the problems of today? So we're in a time of quite rapid climate change with extreme weather events. We don't really know how it's going to pan out, and different measures that parts of the world will take or not take. But through this understanding of how roots have evolved and plants have evolved, might there be something that we can draw upon to make our trees and woody structure plants work harder for us in terms of carbon sequestration, soil stabilization, and also drawing down of nutrients? What are your thoughts on that? It's a bit of a big, impossible question, so you can step out of being a true scientist here and just be a chap who's interested.
No, it's a wonderful question, and it's one that I think about a lot. I think it's really important that so the work that we do in the lab, lots of that comes from taxpayer money, and one of our key things is to educate, to learn more about the fundamentals of the world, but also to think really what can these fossils tell us that will be able to benefit and be of use to the people of the UK, but also people of the world. And actually, I think fossils have a really key part to play in trying to understand what's likely to happen with changing climate in the future. And the reason for that is the fossil record gives us direct evidence of how plants have survived and able to thrive through really extreme conditions in the past. And so by studying some of these examples in the past, we can actually begin to predict what might happen in the future. Now, sadly, one of the big issues we're facing at the moment is just the level and the speed of warming and the speed of change is just unprecedented. So it's hard to know what might happen. But what we can definitely find is clear examples of plant groups in the past that have been able to move. They've traditionally been able to track climate. So you can really see the movement of big plant groups. And we know this is a lot more difficult in today's world because we like to build cities and roads, and again, the speed of the warming is so fast that plants aren't able to evolve. But there's clear evidence in the past of plants being able to do this. This was one way they were able to get around things. We also know that there have been periods of time when many plants have gone extinct. There's been mass extinction events for plants as well as animals. But interestingly, there's been fewer of major extinction events for plants. They've been able to weather some pretty tough storms in ways that many groups didn't. As I said, the flowering plants were really taking shape at the time when the dinosaurs went extinct with an asteroid, and yet the plants were able to rebound from these kind of conditions. So they're remarkably resilient, and I think studying some of these times in the past can be really informative. I think going to your point about some of the specifics, things that really interest me are examples of these linked with rooting systems. So we know that plant roots have a really key part to play in soil stabilization. You can see this on a global level. We know that the origin of plant roots were essential to forming the first soils. And I think that again should just be a lesson to us about the importance of maintaining land with plants on and extensive rooting systems today. And also the fossil record can really give some clues to things that might be novel ways of actually thinking and approaching some of these big challenges we're facing today. We talked about the Carboniferous, this period of time when plants buried vast amounts of carbon, which sadly we've burnt today as coal. But it's interesting to think that during the Carboniferous, that was CO2 in the air. Those plants captured that CO2 from the air and were able to lock that up and bury it. So they've done things like this before, and we can be inspired by those. And the other one would be weathering as well. So the origin of plant roots really increased the amount of weathering. So it increased chunks of weathering in certain areas, and that in itself drew down CO2. So there's been some really nice initiatives about how we can actually grind up bits of rock and actually put those on fields as well, such as basalt. And the actual weathering of that not only can give some nutrients, in some cases can give some nutrients to plants, but can actually act as a catalyst for drawing down more CO2. So yeah, I think it's a wonderful question. I think it's one that myself and many plant scientists are keen to think about. So I think it's a great one to continue thinking about.
And finally, we've gone back in time and imagined walking through a Devonian forest. I'm now going to fly forward 20 years because Elon Musk is planning to colonize Mars. And Mars is a rocky planet. So we're just having a bit of fun here. But they think they found water there in the past, and correct me if I'm wrong. But might scientists erroneously or inappropriately or appropriately, I don't know, I don't make any moral judgments on this, and are kind of way beyond my comfort zone and my knowledge in talking about this. But in terms of what we know from evolution of plants, could that scientific knowledge be used to help colonize Mars? And do you know if that's already being thought about in terms of the new plant evolution of a planet? What are your thoughts on that?
A brilliant question. Again, one which, again, I think it just it gets people excited, and actually it's just quite a nice catalyst to start rethinking about the questions that we spend our day-to-day thinking about. And so I think the main question where people have thought about quite a lot, and I put quite a bit of energy, is not necessarily Mars, but it's getting to Mars in the first place.
Yes.
So there's actually a surprisingly large number of studies of plants being grown in space.
Okay.
To work out what on earth plants do in zero gravity. Because this is a really good question, and some of the difficulty that causes from that. Because there's one big advantage. I mean, if you can have plants happily growing in your spaceship, then you've got this lovely supply of oxygen with you there at the time, and the prospect of having food and things. So yes, it definitely is an area that people are really interested in exploring about what how plants do survive in these kind of low gravity environments. What would be the best plants? What would be the ideal plant to take up with you? Is it best to think about just having some algae you could keep in some water and control in a very very set environment, or do you have something which is longer growing and can live longer? That's one really good question. And the other thing, again, which scientists are definitely doing, is trying to grow plants in rock samples taken from Mars. So
wow, I didn't know that.
So again, it's we can either simulate what we think, based on the small samples. We can kind of scale up the small rock samples we have to make predictions about what that rocky rocky, sandy substrate would actually look like, and then just plonk plants in it and see how they get on. And then as we get the prospect of getting more and more samples back, makes it more likely you can actually have a go at growing them in controlled environments and things. So, yep, scientists always love questions like this, and will continue to think about them. I think it's a really exciting. It's just quite a fun avenue to really give the world to give a bit of a different perspective to the day-to-day research we do.
Fantastic. So this podcast has been recorded on the 7th of November 2024. Things have just changed in America, and Elon Musk is going to be in a slightly new position. This is a non-political podcast, but I thought it would be fun to explore what might happen next in Mars, and I had no idea. And I'm curious. I want to know more about growing plants on Mars. But Dr. Sandy Hetherington, you have absolutely shone a light on the mists of time and where we are today. And I like to imagine you going and digging up fossils, driving around different museums, working hard in the lab with your wonderful colleagues. I'm sure you're a great team. Different types of sampling, and now modelling, so that we, the non-paleobiologist, have a greater understanding of what's happened, why, and how it can help us in the future. Dr. Sandy Hetherington from the Hetherington Institute, thank you so much for your time and your enthusiasm.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure being on the show.